Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lovely afternoon at Small Wonder. Contrary to expectations, Joe hasn't brought the rain from Ireland. He's brought the sunshine. But before I start introducing Joe and Dymphna, who's a surprise, because you won't have seen her name in the brochure, I just have to go through a few safety announcements. So just please take a minute to note emergency exits, which I'm pointing to the one on my right over there, also at the back where you came in. However, if there were to be an emergency, which would be extremely unlikely, the stewards who will identify themselves, the Charleston stewards, would identify themselves very quickly and will explain what to do. It has never happened, and we're not anticipating it today. Also, to ask you, please, to switch off your mobiles if you haven't already done so. So I think the rest is common sense. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Joseph O'Connor to Small Wonder, plus the chairperson for this afternoon's proceedings, Dymphna Flynn. And it's an extra special pleasure and honour that this is the launch event for Joseph O'Connor's new short story collection, Where Have You Been? His first collection in more than 20 years. But as I will explain, he's been quite busy in between. Joseph O'Connor was born in Dublin. He's the author of the novels Cowboys and Indians, shortlisted for the Whitbread Prize, Desperados, The Salesman, Inish Owen, Star of the Sea, and Redemption Falls, as well as a number of best-selling works of non-fiction. He's also written film scripts and stage plays. His multi-award-winning novel Star of the Sea was an international bestseller and was published in 38 languages. His most recent novel, Ghostlight, was published in June 2010 to rave reviews internationally and spent 9 weeks as a #1 Irish bestseller. And it was chosen as Dublin's One City, One Book in 2011. In December 2011, Joseph O'Connor received an honorary doctorate in literature from University College Dublin. He's the winner of the Irish Pen Award for Outstanding Contribution to Irish Literature. And in 2012, and was recently voted Irish Writer of the Decade by the readers of Hot Press. And for the uninitiated, Hot Press isn't the Irish version of Hello, as far as I understand. It's Ireland's long-standing, smart, provocative cultural magazine. However, it is as an exemplary short story writer that we're welcoming Joseph O'Connor this afternoon. According to the Irish Times, a writer who reveals the power of the short story to speak for our time, and I would add, across time. Dymphna Flynn, who's chairing this afternoon, was born in London of Irish parents, but that's not her only qualification for chairing this event. Dymphna has been a producer of BBC Radio 4 for over 20 years. She's worked on a wide range of programmes for all the major networks, radios 1 to 5, and is currently producing Book Club and Front Row for BBC Radio 4. So I'm going to hand over to Joseph O'Connor. He'll read from his new collection. He'll tell you what he's going to read himself. He'll then have a conversation with Dymphna, and then he'll be glad to answer questions from the audience. Joseph O'Connor.
Thank you very much. I want to say what a great pleasure it is to be here again at this festival, one of my favourite festivals anywhere in the world, and just to thank everybody here for being so hospitable and so warm. The last time I read here, I remembered very fondly, punctuated by the sound of cows. I was looking through my book of short stories earlier, thinking, this is a book of Irish short stories. There must surely be one in which cows feature, but I couldn't find one. So I'm going to read to you instead from the final story in the book. The book is called Where Have You Been? And the final piece in the book is called Where Have You Been? And it's a suite of short stories, I suppose, or a novella. And it's set more or less in the contemporary world. And it's a love story. So I'm going to read to you from that for about 35 minutes, I think, and then have a chat. So here we go, from Where Have You Been? 1. Scenes from a Hurricane, Dublin, 2010. Several years after his divorce, as his 30s came to a close, Cian Hanaho spent 5 weeks in hospital. What had happened was referred to as an episode by the consultant psychiatrist, a scrupulously courteous, slightly eccentric Ulsterman who stirred his coffee with a biro that looked as if it had been given free with a boy's comic, in that it had a plastic eyeball in place of a clicker. Cian Hanaho had little to say. It didn't seem to matter. The season began to change. The monks who cared for the patients asked no questions about the past. He found them wise, admirably realistic, secretive. One of them, a brother Lowry, facilitated an informal writing group for patients, after which he would encourage them to play CDs or tapes. He had a theory that traditional songs were actually short stories. If a patient volunteered to sing, which happened surprisingly often, he had a habit of scribbling down the lyrics. An inner-city Dubliner, he was 40 and had tattoos on his forearms. In his cowl, which he wore only occasionally, preferring jeans and a hoodie, he looked like a middleweight Rasputin. He was a gruff, nice man, so it seemed to Cian Hanaho, and had the kind of belief in God that gives no offence to those with less certain positions. He would even mutter, "Merciful Christ," when irked about something small, like the coffee vending machine in the day room being out of order again, or one of the red balls on the snooker table being missing. It was rumoured of him that he had once threatened to have a pompous psychiatrist sectioned under the Mental Health Act, an incident that had greatly increased his stock among his charges. In the evenings, when the hospital was quiet, Cian Hanaho would make an attempt at writing, but it was difficult to know what to write. The brief for the class was to begin with a short piece of memoir, to fix on one remembered incident from childhood and simply describe it as it had occurred. The piece should be no more than one side of foolscap, and the event need not have special significance. The task was to write it down quickly, using the first words or expressions that came to mind. But how to begin? Where did any event begin? He would walk the paths and groves of the hospital grounds, trying to enter the past. One morning, in the showers, an incident came to him so completely that he felt it was what he had been waiting for. But by the time he had returned to the ward, the piece was composing itself in his mind. Scared that he would lose the words, he scribbled them down so quickly and aggressively that the pencil lead snapped as he scrawled. He read it over a few times before tearing it up. And when later in the day he opened his notebook again, it was not to write anything of his life, his own memories, but to draft out a letter to a Dublin newspaper, one of whose columnists had written a scathing piece about bankers. They were little better than traitors, the article said. They had wrecked the whole country, turned it into a casino. They had all known the facts. None of them cared. A strange rage invaded him as he penned his response. He crumpled it and threw it away. His line manager visited weekly. They were difficult occasions. It was hard to know what to say, what to leave unsaid. Mainly they spoke of the weather or sports, little incidents at the office, the trees in the hospital grounds. If there was anything he needed, he had only to say, but he couldn't think of anything to ask for. He returned in time to work. People were quietly welcoming. It was clear they knew everything, although nobody made any reference to what had happened. He was asked to move temporarily to the bank's public relations department. They needed extra backroom help, he was told. It became evident to him that colleagues were quietly organising the tasks that came his way so that they would not be overly taxing, would run with the things that interested him. Their decency and discretion moved him, but it could not be acknowledged. He was asked to write a speech for the chairman of the board, who was presenting a sports prize the bank sponsored for underprivileged schools. Since the downturn, it was important to get these things right. There had been unhelpful and damaging publicity. It was several months later when a co-worker told him there had been a phone call while he'd been out at lunch from a woman called Catherine Dwyer, a Londoner here for work. She had been given the bank's number by a librarian in Arklow. She was production designer for a major television series that was to be shot in Ireland, a remake of Wuthering Heights. The project had received funding from the Irish Film Board. She was based at Ardmore Studios in Wicklow. What's that to do with us? Haven't a breeze, Cian, she didn't say. An older colleague chipped in. We've some painting she wants to have a look at. Apparently it's downstairs. She sent someone a fax, but I can't find it. The painting or the fax? Neither of them, actually. Would you give her a shout, Cian? I'm up to me eyes at the minute. Her mode on the phone was clipped, a bit harassed and disjointed, as though several conversations were going on at the moment and she wasn't sure which one she belonged in. He was surprised when she came into the bar of the Shelburne Hotel by the principal boy litheness of her look. He had expected someone older. She might have been 30. She was taller than Cian Hanaho and seemed at ease in the room. And since walking into a new room tended to make him feel ungainly, he found self-possession a sort of beguilement in others. It was raining very heavily as she hurried in from Kildare Street so that her hair clung in straggles to her forehead. There was a stud in her nose. She was wearing lace gloves. There was something buccaneerish going on with the coat. His father would have said she cut a dash or had a nice figure. She pulled her mobile from her pocket and looked at it resentfully. "Is it Catherine Dwyer?" he said. "You must be the man from the bank. So sorry I'm late." Her handshake was firm and quick. "I got in before the crowd," he said. "I have a table over here." "Do you mind if we stand?" she said. "I'm in a bit of a rush. Bugger of a taxi man overcharged me, slightly distrait. How are you?" "I'm fine," he said. "Would you like something to drink?" "No, thanks, just water. Are you from Dublin yourself?" "Well, Dunleary, really," he said. "It's about 8 miles south." "That was called Kingstown, right?" she said, "in the 19th century." "The same. When our lot were in charge." She gave a playful grin. "With a name like Dwyer," he said, "you're surely one of our own." "Oh, only about an eighth, I'm afraid," she said. "You'll have to forgive me," he said. "I'm not quite sure what a production designer does." "Oh, it's how the show looks, really. The locations, the sets. I so wish we were allowed to bloody smoke. Do you smoke yourself?" "I'm trying to give them up," he said. "We could stand outside if you like." "Oh, not with the rain," she said. "Shall I start pestering you now? How dreary at the end of your day." "It's my pleasure," he said. "How can I help? My colleague didn't say." "I'm interested in the paintings of the Irish artist Sean or John Keating," she said. "Are there some in the bank's collection? A colleague at Ardmore told me there were." She waited for a communal roar at some sporting event on the television to die down before she continued. "I'm on the trail of anything large-scale featuring County Wicklow in particular, just thinking of different handles on landscape. There's one I've been trying to dig up called Scenes from a Hurricane. Nobody seems to know where it is." "I don't know that particular one," he said, "but yes, I believe we've a few Keatings in the collection. I can look it up and get back to you if you give me your email. Have you tried the National Gallery? And there's an excellent private gallery, White's, they're just down the street here. They'd often have work by Keating, and their catalogue essays are good." She started making notes of what he was saying, and he found it oddly arresting to watch her, perhaps because she knew old-fashioned shorthand. She had worked as a features reporter in London, she explained, before giving it up for art school at the age of 25. Late starter, I'm afraid. Everyone else was about 7. They're all making millions in fashion now. "Do you enjoy working in television?" he asked. "It must be a fascinating world. Full of absolute fucking tossers, if you'll pardon my French." "Was your degree in commerce?" "Maths and history," he said, "and I've a H-dip, a teaching diploma. Why?" "Just you don't seem a typical man from the bank." She had taken out a compact and was reapplying her lip gloss as they talked. "I kind of drifted into it," he said. "It was meant to be a stopgap, and then, I don't know, Can I be your assistant? She deadpanned. It sounds pretty cool to work in a bank. You'd find it fairly unexciting, he said. I can assure you we're not too popular these days. Yes, I've noticed, she said, you're somewhere between paedophile priests and corrupt politicians, according to the papers over here. They kept talking, and he gave her some pamphlets he had brought as an afterthought about forthcoming exhibitions and lectures. He told her of wild places in Wicklow she might wish to see, a forgotten glen near Imal, a ruined village close to Kirtlestown, scribbling directions and guidelines to landmarks on the photocopied ordnance survey maps she produced from her briefcase. There was an easiness about her companionship. It was like being with someone he already knew. When she begged a sip of his coffee, it didn't seem strange to be sharing the cup. After an hour, she mentioned she was hungry, and it occurred to him there might be a chance to continue the evening. We could maybe have something to eat, he said, if you're free. There's an Italian on Dame Street. It's a little place called Nico's, kind of a Dublin institution. Oh, I'm meeting someone. Sorry, she said. He might pop by in a minute. Of course, well, anyhow, I'd better be heading on. Another time, though, if you'd like, she said. I'm in town now and again. Sometimes I have to come up to the National Library or Trinity. Maybe you'd let me drag you away for a sandwich and a fag. That would be grand if you're at a loose end, he said. I've rarely anything on at lunchtime. Oh, look, here's my date coming now. An absurdly handsome man in his late 20s stepped out of the crowd and approached them with a sodden umbrella. His long coat was splashed and muddy, and he was wearing a furry hat that made him look like a Russian cavalry officer. Christ, Catherine, sorry I'm late, he spoke with a Galway accent. Hi, Kevin. God, look at you. This is Mr. Hanaho. He's a man from the bank. He's tremendously important, and he's also very helpful. Nods were exchanged and brief pleasantries traded. A certain amount of collaborative mockery was made of Catherine Dwyer, since her date's name was not in fact Kevin, but a Gaelic version, Cuiveen, and he revealed that she had once asked him if this began with a Q, a letter not existing in the Irish language. She chuckled in mortification as the anecdote was told, touching its teller often and fondly on the arm. His face was freckled and broad, his smile deeply good-natured. I don't mean to be clock-watching, but we'd nearly want to be making tracks, Catherine, he said. The table's booked for 7:30. It was nice meeting you, Cian, she said. Thanks very much for the pointers. Let me give you my number and maybe you'd bell me if the picture turns up. Of course, he said. Have a nice evening. Call me, okay? I will, he said. And they shook hands as she left. There we are. Just on cue. He gave in his notice in October, was permitted to leave without serving it out in full. There was a medical context, his superior had explained, and whoever needed to agree had agreed. He was asked if he would like a gathering of some kind, maybe drinks in head office or a small dinner with colleagues. It would have to be small. Times had changed. He replied that he wouldn't like anything at all. Really, he just wanted to go. He left the premises for the last time on a drizzly Wednesday at lunchtime. On his way towards the DART station, he pushed unnoticed through a crowd of reporters and television cameramen that had gathered by the gates of government buildings. The delegation from the IMF had arrived in Dublin to put the bankrupt country on life support. The motorcade came up Merrion Street, flanked by Garda motorcycle outriders. He watched the journalists pushing closer to the limousine, microphones thrusting out. It was raining heavily by now, and some of the cameramen and reporters were dressed in sou'westers like fishermen. He felt a strange, intense sympathy for the men from the IMF, but it was probably the benzodiazepine kicking in. Someone had organised a collection to buy Cian Hanaho a parting gift, a €100 book token for Eason's. The card had been signed by almost everyone in the department and even by the chairman of the board. He was congratulated on his escape from the lunacy in here, his flit from the madhouse, the bedlam. One colleague, a quiet man, close to retirement himself, had written, "I will miss you greatly, Cian," and a short couplet of Yeats. He had never realised the older man thought of him as a friend. Maybe he didn't really, but it was a compassionate thing to have written. Against all he might have predicted, it became a winter of hope. He began attending the gym, slimming down. In the evenings, he would drive into Wicklow and meet Catherine Dwyer at Ardmore. She was scouting night shoot locations that would be accessible for a crew and finding them difficult to come up with. Bloody Wuthering Heights, she'd say. Every other scene happens in darkness. What were those Brontes on? It became a pleasant challenge to help her, a means of companionship. He was doing nothing else, he assured her. He had the feeling she was lonely in Ireland, for all her bonhomie and avowed contentment, had few confidants on the production and no friends in the city. Perhaps she didn't get the codes of Irish professional camaraderie with its subtle mix of mockeries, resentments and fondnesses. She laughed a great deal when she told him stories from the set. The sense grew in him that hiding your hurt was a thing she'd respect, a hard-won, important victory. There was a new arts centre in Bray. They sometimes went there to watch a film or hear music, dining afterwards in one of the little cafes on the seafront. Or they would walk the forlorn promenade past the amusement arcades and kebab shops as heavy metal blasted from the windows of the hotels. It was a wonderful place, she said, not entirely ironically. She really did seem to like it. He showed her Wicklow, hidden lakes, the ruins of old mines, bog meadows, Raven's Glen, the waterfall at Powerscourt. She was a reason to visit again the places of his childhood Sundays, their names sounding beautiful in her London accent. Deuce Mountain, Tonduff, Carragulligan, Knocksink, Ochavanna, Glenmalure, Anamo, Loch Nahangan. The grave of the painter Paul Henry in the churchyard at Enniskerry, not far from Lover's Leap Rock. She asked him to show her his favourite view of all. He brought her hiking up a steep-ditched switchback path above the reforestation project at Kilmullen. On the eastern horizon, they could just make out the peaks of Snowdonia, the bald drumlin of Holy Island at the entrance to Holyhead. She returned to London for 10 days over Christmas. He found that he missed her, wanted to collect her at Dublin Airport, and had set out in the car to surprise her before realising it was too loaded a gesture, the kind of thing lovers did. He pulled into the breakdown lane on the side of the M50, sat there almost an hour trying to sort his thoughts. He watched the planes coming in. She would be on one of them, he knew. To approach her across the arrivals concourse, to embrace her, take her bag. Would she be happy to see him there, or find his presence unnerving, more than would be expected from a friend? In the end, he sat so long that she must have landed by then, was probably in a taxi back to the hotel or to Ardmore. She had mentioned there would be a very late script meeting that night. Money people were coming in from Los Angeles. For several days, she did not call. Often, he had the phone in his hand, but some reluctance he couldn't fathom made him unable to dial her number. He had begun to give up hope, but one night when he returned to the apartment, having been to a film alone in the city, his answering machine was flashing a red 1. For a while, his apprehensiveness had made him incapable of playing it. He made coffee, took a shower, opened a beer. The couple in the neighbouring apartment were having an argument. He watched part of an old movie on Sky. He never looked at the RTE evening news anymore. He found he was almost afraid of it. Cian, it's Catherine Dwyer. Her saying his name. The message was briskly genial, like an affectionate sister's. She had been busy, it was crazy. Had he been well, as she hoped? It had been good to see London. She had visited her parents. It was nice for my mother to be able to get on my case. If he'd like to have a New Year pint, she'd be clearer after the weekend. But I expect you're probably busy. No pressure. They met in what used to be the El Fin Hotel in Dunleary, but was now some sort of gastropub with gas heaters outside. She was tanned, relaxed, with her hair tied back, and was wearing a leather jacket he hadn't seen her in. Some of the gaffers at Ardmore had been teaching her bits of classroom Irish as a joke. Cunis, see shias. Silence, sit down. Ondigan to, do you understand? Moshe the Holle, please. Cách ní dúr is anam dom. Catherine Dwyer is my name. On Raifa har clealum, he laughed. What's funny, she inquired, isn't that, may I please be excused? He had to explain that it was actually, would you go over the ditch with me? A time-honoured Gaelic invitation to al fresco sex. How do you say you fucking bastards in Irish, she asked him. Ah, that's easy, he told her. Englishmen. One night, they went into the city to see a production of Juno and the Paycock at the Abbey. He loved sitting beside her in the darkness, being close to her. Not to be alone in the pews of the theatre, to have someone to share a programme, a murmured joke between acts. The sense that she might touch you during a scene change if she wanted something small explained. At the interval, he found himself hoping someone he knew would be in the foyer. He would have liked to introduce her, to be seen with her in public, and for word to go around that she was beautiful and amusing and smarter than anyone in the room. She couldn't begin to see what he liked in the play, found it burlesque, full of cliches, the dialogue ridiculously florid and the women characters ruinously unconvincing. But afterwards, in the flowing tide pub across the street, some of the actors arrived, looking weary and cool, and like everyone else in the pub, she was entranced as she watched them, moving conspiratorially among each other, swapping teases and embraces, like mariners returned from some forbidden adventure and sworn to fraternal secrecies. The girl who had played Mary Boyle was in ripped Levi's and a tank top, her blue-black hair combed straight, long and loose, and she fought a running battle of imprecations with the long-suffering barman who kept insisting he'd put her out if she smoked. She was queenly, a chuckler, a drinker of Jack Daniels and ginger, and when she sang "My Love is in America" at the end of the night, it was as though this was the truer play. They ate quarter-pounders and fries in a dive on O'Connell Street with the winos and the junkies and the night people. A flirtatious Russian security guard told him he was lucky to be marry such a beautiful wife. On hearing it, she laughed diplomatically, pushed her hair behind her ears, and in the almost painful brightness of the Muzak-filled burger bar, looked into his eyes for a second too long before returning to the coffee she said was hideous. He drove her back to Bray, the hotel on the main street, with Bob Dylan's Street Legal on the tape deck and the smoke of her cigarettes and her never-ending talk filling the space between them. I'll always remember tonight, she said, but it was a terrible piece of Irish rubbish. I enjoyed your company, Catherine, thanks. Do you like it, really, that awful play? I suppose I do, yeah. I better go in. Okay, he said. Should I have one last fag? Are you hurrying home? No, fire away, you're grand. Would you like one yourself, Cian? I'm kind of off them, but okay. Funny character, that Russian earlier. It's nice to have a husband who doesn't mind me smoking. I'm tolerant. Yeah, she said, that's the reason I married you. That and your looks. Well, and your money, of course. At 1 a.m, she crossed to a kebab shop on the corner and got coffees and a bottle of water while he walked to the all-night petrol station down the street for cigarettes and the chewing gum she wanted. It was almost 2:30 when she slipped from his car. Every Dylan CD in the glove box had been played and no cigarettes were left. Their talk had been easy. There was a sort of freedom in the lateness and in sitting in a car where you didn't have to look at each other face to face. The windscreen steamed. She carved spirals with her fingers, played X's and O's with herself as they conversed. He told her stories from the bank. She told him about her parents' divorce. She had dallied with sculpture at art school, liked early Bowie, Virginia Woolf, Shostakovich. She believed in God. The world would be meaningless if she didn't, she said, like saying you didn't believe in Emma Bovary just because Flaubert had made her up. There was one subject she refused to allude to, but its deliberate absence seemed a presence, as though a passenger was sleeping in the back seat of the car and might be awoken if his existence were acknowledged. It was obvious that there was someone in London, but she never mentioned him directly, never offered details or a name. Neither did she ask outright about Cian's own situation, until one evening when they were walking White Rock Strand, she said, "Did you have children? You and your wife, I mean." "My wife?" Someone at Ardmore told me she'd been at UCD with your wife. Your ex, I mean. Is it Elaine? Afric is her name, he said. No, we didn't have children. You didn't want to, may I ask? We'd hoped to. It didn't work out. She nodded. Understood, I'm very sorry, let's leave it. She was a great person, he found himself saying. Afric, I mean, what happened was cruel. You couldn't begin to explain it when a marriage ends. You're in touch, are you still? Not really, he said. She's moved on. We'd send cards at Christmas, nothing more. She had a baby a couple of months ago. He's called Robert. She's living in Manchester. He had never said the child's name aloud before. He lit a cigarette, took a drag. He had the feeling she was going to touch him out of something like sympathy, and he didn't want that to happen. It loomed up at him, the night he had spent on the internet looking for a present on sites for babies' clothes, the care with which he had worded the email, from Cian, all the best of happiness. 7 words in the end, after numerous hours of trying, and so many redraftings that he couldn't bear to think of it now. To press send had been hard. To receive the thank you card harder. He had thrown it away after reading it only once. And for you, Catherine, he said, there's someone in London. Do you mind me asking? He's living in New York at the moment for work, she said. But yes, there's someone. Someone puts it very well, I would say. He's someone called Paul Anderson. What does he do? He's in television, is he? His card says he's an entertainment industry lawyer, she said, whatever that means. It's serious. 4 years, she said. Well, we're on a break right now, one of those complicated situations. I'm not the greatest picker of all time, as it happens. I don't care for nice men. But then there's been the occasional exception, of course. Actually, he's very nice. He's like you. I'd have been surprised if there was nobody, he said. How did you know? Just, you sometimes say we, like we went to a concert or we were in Italy or whatever. I just noticed. And did you love her? She said. Afric. What a beautiful name. He took a long drink from the carton of orange juice they'd been sharing while they walked. Look, I really don't talk about it now, he said. I've kind of made it a rule. I know I probably should, but I just decided not to. I don't mean to be offhand. I just find it works for me not to. Do you have sisters? She asked. No, I don't, he said. I've a younger brother. I would have sworn you had sisters. Funny. He drove her back to the hotel, and they sat in his car on the main street while the young people darted in and out of the burger shops, laughing, shouting. It was the night before St. Patrick's Day, he realized suddenly. Many of the kids were already drunk. Look at them, she said. Do you wish we were 18? I wish both of us were, he said. Funny situation, this. I guess it is, he agreed, right enough. Do you know what I think we should do, Cian? What? I think we should go into the hotel, order a bottle of vodka, sit in the bar and drink it and talk about nothing serious at all. And whatever happens after that never happened. Okay. You're sure? I mean it literally. Nothing ever happened. I understand, he said. Okay then, she said, let's not bother with the vodka. Her room in the hotel was small and far too hot, and there was an untidy pile of papers on the table by the window with her portfolios and rip sheets and sketchbooks. A laptop showed a screensaver of her and a man at the Statue of Liberty. She checked her emails before powering it off. A blue dress he had seen her wearing was hanging in the bathroom doorway in a dry cleaner's polythene sack. There were several pairs of running socks drying in the sink, a couple of stacked paperbacks on the rim of the cracked enamel bath, and there was a makeup bag like a child's pencil case sitting on the windowsill, spilling a cargo of lipsticks and old tube tickets. He heard her moving about in the bedroom as he washed his face and hands, and when he came to her, she had taken off her pullover and unbuttoned her jeans. There was a minibar set into a cabinet, and its door was open, its humming yellow light illuminating a parallelogram of threadbare carpet. She was holding 2 miniatures of gin and lightly trembling. Would you like a drink? She asked. No thanks, he said. Are you scared, Cian? A bit. Me too, she said. I've not done anything like this in a very long time. Let's lie down for a while, okay? For perhaps 10 minutes afterwards, nothing was said. Rain spattered the windows, flinging itself against the glass. A car alarm began an insistent bleat. He wondered if she was sleeping. Her breathing was so steady. The radiator by the trouser press gave an irritable crank. She stirred, took his hand, and kissed it. You're very beautiful, Catherine, he said, to be with you like this. Indeed, and I'm not, she laughed. But then, beauty is the gift of the lover. Can you sing, Cian? I'm not much of a use at singing, no. If you sing me a song now, she said, I'll be your mate forever, I swear. What kind of song? Dancing Queen by ABBA. Fuck off, he laughed. The wolf tones, then. Yeah, right. I'd say you sing awesomely, she said. You must have been told you've a sexy voice, especially over the phone. You could charge by the minute. She was smiling at him as she reached out to caress his face. But she was one of those people whose smile includes stoicism deployed against the ghost of old hurts. You're a babe, aren't you really, she said. So how come you're not taken? Should I ask? Is it a state secret or something? Probably, he said. She nodded. Stop pushing him, Catherine. He'll tell you when he wants to. This was a strategy she sometimes deployed when she wanted to ask a question, spoke it aloud to herself so that it could be dismissed as a joke if necessary. But it was a powerful way of asking all the same. The last couple of years were tricky enough for me, he said. It got on top of me a bit, I don't know. I got stressed, fucked up, I suppose. There were problems at work. I made serious mistakes, took my eye off the ball. Were you hospitalized? She asked. He laughed abruptly, accepted a drag of her cigarette. You've good sources. Yeah, I was for a while. He looked around the room, trying to find something to talk about. A pair of her boots in the opened wardrobe, stacks of CDs on the carpet, photographs torn from colour supplements or Xeroxed from Wicklow guidebooks, sellotaped to the dressing table mirror, scrawled yellow and pink post-its forming a chessboard pattern across the door, a skirt folded over a chair back. Angela, a girl at work, she said quietly. She knows everything about everyone in Ireland. She's just one of those people that hoovers information. Once upon a time, she'd have been burnt as a witch. Can I sleep here the night with you? He asked. Disquietude silvered her eyes. I don't think that would be wise. Would you mind? Look, say if I threw all my clothes out the window over there, he said. You wouldn't send me out in the buff, or would you? She put a finger to his lips. Cunis, she murmured. The Irish for silence. Just this once, he said, I promise. I'll never ask again. She looked at him. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? I won't be, he said, I promise. It never even happened. Oh, you menace, she said. Leave me alone, or don't leave me alone. Would you like to have another fag before you go? I have to bring my dad to the doctor in the morning at 7:45, he said. I'll be gone before you even remember I was here. Cian Hanaho, she said quietly. I like saying your name. So does that mean I can stay? He asked. You could think of me as a tease maid. You're certainly a tease, she said. And you're certainly a maid. Hardly. Well, meet me halfway. The disco can get loud, she said, downstairs. Do you mind? No, I'm a 70s boy. I love disco. The rain began to thunder as she curled her back against his chest. From outside on the street, they heard the young people shrieking. He sang quietly into the nest of her matted hair. Fare thee well to the moss house where the birds do increase. At the foot of Mount Leinster or some silent place. And all Illinois I would give for your hand by the banks of the Claudie in Wexford's lost land. I'm warning you, if you want any sleep, you better stop, she whispered. He stopped and he started again. Thank you. With apologies for my singing there.
Thanks very much, Joseph. I was interested when I read the story off the page and then hearing you read it again. The priest, Father Lowry, he talks about traditional songs being, what is his theory?
That they're short stories.
That they're actually short stories. And I just wondered if that's something that you agree with it's such an oral tradition that we come from in Ireland, that does it transpose?
Well, I think it's one of the interesting things that these islands, these two islands, share. I mean, it's a very striking thing when you look at the history of the ballad form, how ideas and concepts and visual images occur in Scottish and English and Irish ballads. It's one of the beautiful ironies, I suppose, of a history where the two islands were so often in a relationship of enmity or lack of understanding, that they contributed so much to each other's ballad tradition. And I love those stories. They're so dark and strange and so sweet. And I suppose I have a theory myself that if a story could not be expressed as a traditional ballad, that it probably isn't worth telling. You know, I think every novel, like my novel Star of the Sea, in which ballads play an important part, you should be able to say, this is the beginning, and this is the middle, and this is the end. And you can have all of the richness and sophistication that your talent can bring to bear on it. But I think one thing the ballad tells you is a story is for an audience. The audience is part of a story. I mean, so many Irish and English and Scottish ballads begin with the audience in the first line. There's often a form of address. Come gather round me, comrades all, and listen to my song. I mean, the storyteller knows there is an audience here, and his job is to grab them. So the ballad isn't really about self-expression. It's a much more communal thing involving the audience. And I suppose it's been a key for me in my own work. I really think that what a writer does is to provide the sheet music, and it's the reader who sings the song. And you have to be absolutely aware of that. The reading is a far more miraculous thing, really, than writing is. I mean, if you look at a book, it's just simply a collection of these little black ink stains on a page. The really miraculous thing is that each reader takes that and sings the song in his head or her head, and the song is different to all of us. So I'm always thinking about the reader, you know, more than the critic or anybody else, you know. And I think you write the book or the story that you'd like to be reading yourself.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, of course, as an Irish writer, is the many brilliant short story writers that have come before.
Yes, too many.
Too many. And I noticed that in this book, the very short story, the very first story that opens, Two Little Clouds, you've described it as a response to James Joyce, A Little Cloud from Dubliners. I just wondered if you could sort of talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, Joyce's wonderful collection of short stories, which many people here will have read and will know. Dubliners, an incredibly influential book still. And the early stories in Dubliners are about childhood. And then there's an extraordinary kind of suite of stories in the middle about disappointed middle-aged men who didn't leave Ireland and who have failed and who wanted to be writers or musicians, say, when they were young, and it didn't work out. And in one of these stories, A Little Cloud, an old college friend of this man, of the central character, who's emigrated to London, comes back to Dublin for a weekend of kind of passive-aggressive boasting about how absolutely wonderful everything is in London and the great life he has over there. And you get over to Paris, and the cabaret in Paris is very naughty. And how are things going with you here in dear old rainy Catholic priest-ridden Dublin? And the entire purpose of the visit has been to crush this man. And it's a very interesting story, and I suppose I thought often in the era of the recent lately departed Celtic tiger in Dublin, when Dublin became a trendy place for a while, that it would be interesting to take that story and turn it on its head, that suddenly to be living in Dublin was a great thing. So it takes that story the other way around a man who emigrated to London in the 80s and who's made quite a nice life there, and he's married and settled down and he has a job. He comes back to Dublin and he meets this former college friend who's become a sort of grotesque estate agent who just loves money and the brashness that was around in Ireland during those eras and or during that era, and has this year's car and sort of worships the euro the way his grandmother would have worshipped the Virgin Mary, you know, that kind of character. So it's called Two Little Clouds, just as a little tip of the cap to the great Mr. Joyce's A Little Cloud, which inspired it. Yeah, but you don't have to know that to have read it. My publishers have asked me to point out.
Oh, well, I won't ask you my next question then, which was going to be about Eddie Virago, the estate agent who worships the euro, because he actually came from your very first book, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
I won't ask you about that then if you don't want to go back.
Oh, well, you can ask me anything you want in the privacy of this room.
But what I really, really liked about the book was the range of times that it covers. And you've talked about the Celtic tiger, and that first opening story is, I think, in 2007, before the crash of 2008. It goes back to 1988 to a Euro match between England and Ireland that was quite a big kind of cultural event. There's a story from Manhattan from 1869. And just kind of looking, and then this very last piece that you read actually finishes in 2012, doesn't it?
It finishes in September 2012.
So very current.
So it's very, very difficult to write that back in February or March this year and anticipate, sort of hope that nothing huge would have happened in August.
Yeah.
You know? But thankfully nothing did.
Well, I just wondered whether there was...
It ends, it's sort of Ireland in recession. And I remember writing the end of it and thinking, it's going to be awful now if we discover in August massive reserves of oil off the coast of Connemara. You know, that's really going to bugger this story up.
Well, some of us remember gold on the top of Croagh Patrick.
Yes, well, that would be very nice too. But anyway, that didn't happen so far.
But, I mean, as a writer, do you feel, not exactly a responsibility, but do you feel, it seems to me that you're really interested in the here and now of all these different events, that you're almost chronicling it. Was that something you'd agree with?
It's a lesser interest for me, I must say. I mean, I've always been motivated more by characters, I suppose, than by themes. You know, a story for me starts with a human situation. You know, that story would have started with thinking, what would that be like if that man who had gone through that experience were to meet that particular woman? And then you realize that, of course, because a story is set somewhere, a story is set in a context, that you have to get the background right. But I don't really think that journalism and fiction should do the same thing. I mean, I've worked a lot as a journalist, and up until very recently I had a column on the radio in Ireland and all of that. And I'm interested in the politics of the situation we're in. But I don't think we go to fiction for that. You know, you go to fiction to be touched. You know, you go to fiction out of a desire for an experience of empathy. There's something in us that wants to know what it's like to be somebody else. And in every society that we've ever contrived, and in every culture, on every continent, there seems to have been somebody whose job was to do that, somebody who's a storyteller. And it's a very profound need in us, and it's the reason why we have fiction. And of course, the beautiful paradox, the miracle of fiction is that when we have that experience of empathy and we know what it's like to be somebody else, we come back to ourselves with a sort of embellished sense of what it's like to be us. You know, it's the most beautiful, magical thing. And you see that in children's fairy tales and nursery rhymes, all the way up through, you know, every sort of literary fiction or fiction that you would read beside the swimming pool on your holidays, you know. So I'm more interested in that than I am in chronicling anything at all, really.
Well, one of the stories that I really enjoyed that you had a real sense of empathy for the characters is the story set in Manhattan. It's quite different from some of the others, which deal with loss and family breakdown and childhood, and there is humour.
Full of laughs.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, there is humour. I've got another question about humour, but that
Thank
story,
God.
that story in Manhattan is full of great physical detail of the tenement building where they live, and this Irish family's life. They're young and they're poor, and sending money back home to Ireland. And there's detail of the descriptions of the tenement house. The father sits on a chair, it's a backless chair. There's immigrant families all around the tenement house who are praying for the very ill child in their German, they're from all over the world. I just wonder how you came across that.
It was a project that was generated by somebody else. I mean, it's an interesting thing to do. There's in Lower Manhattan, a place myself and my wife Anne-Marie know very well. We've lived there a couple of times. There's a wonderful place called the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and it's a former tenement house that has been restored and houses exhibitions of what immigrant life was like in the 19th century. And there's a team of archivists there, and they specialize, I suppose, in not doing generalities. They have established the list of every family's name, whoever lived there. Italian families and London families and Jewish families and Germans and many people over the years. And their approach to their exhibitions is that they look at one family for a period of 3 or 6 months. So they came to me saying they wanted to have an exhibition about Irish immigration to New York based around the life of this one family, the Moore Meehan family, who they know lived in the building.
So they're real, the characters
These
in
are
that
real
story,
people.
actually real people.
Yeah. So they said, here's what our archivists have managed to find out about them. Here are their dates of birth, their jobs, the dates of death, etc. And would you write the catalogue for this exhibition? So I started trying to write the catalogue. And then I thought, wouldn't it be a more interesting experience to write it as a piece of fiction, to take those facts and to build something on top of it that might have happened, something that might have been. And so that's what I did. So it's a piece of fiction based on a sort of a foundation of scattered facts. Certain things in it are true. I think it'll be obvious to readers what parts are true, and then certain parts are imagined. Yeah.
And just going back to the humour, because when you read it quite clearly, you got laughs. It's very funny.
I think that was the cow that got more laughs than me.
And there's one story. I can't remember what it's called. It's the one that I mentioned, set in 1988. It starts off, it's like a farce. It's really, really funny. And then it turns. It becomes really dark.
Is this the story about the football match?
It's the story about the football match, yes, and the wedding reception. And very true to life to any of us that have been to a wedding reception in Kilburn or wherever, in a hall. And can you just say something about that story, where it came from or something,
Yeah, I mean, there's a story in the book set on, I think it's a June day in 1988, and it's a story set in London. And there's a young man working in an office on this boiling hot day, and he really wishes that he were in Stuttgart that day, because the European Soccer Championships are on and Ireland are playing England. And he'd like to see Ireland being beaten by England, as that's our job, that's always our job in sport for 100. We've never beaten England at anything, but he'd like to just be there, and he thinks it'll be a great occasion. And it's a fascinating team of players who are playing for us, because they were born, most of them were born in London or Glasgow or Liverpool, and they speak with those accents, and there are black players playing for the team. And it's an interesting sort of reflection of Irishness being diverse, perhaps more than the images of Irishness you would get in the work of Yeats or Frank McCourt or any of those people, that the actual Ireland might be the one that's going on the football pitch. So amazingly, that day, thanks to the great Ray Houghton, Ireland beat England 1-0 in the match. The only time that I think we ever have, or ever will again. And I think that the Celtic Tiger, if there was a moment when that started, it was that day, because it was the first time we realised, God, sometimes we accidentally win. I mean, our whole role in the world, our purpose of being Irish in the world for 200 years is that there has to be someone who gets rained on, somebody who starves, but sort of cheerfully continues on and doesn't mind. It turns up to a sporting event a sporting event just to be the best fans in the world. And of course, losing is very important, you know, and we don't have football hooliganism or anything like that. We just turn up to be jolly clowns, and that's why God invented Ireland. And it was such a challenge to us to think, oh my God, we've won, and now that changes everything. And now we have to sort of build factories and get our economy together, and you know. So I think the Celtic Tiger really began on that day. So it's secretly a short story about that, I think.
And can you say something about your dialogue writing? Because again, in that story that you read, I thought the dialogue was very true to life. You obviously have an ear for the way that people speak. Do you kind of make notes on buses? Do you eavesdrop?
I used to make notes a lot more than I do anymore. It just looks a bit odd now if you're sitting on the bus writing down people's dialogue around you. But I think it's a useful skill to develop. I mean, whenever I teach writing myself, which I try to every 4 or 5 years, I do always tell my students, this is a great thing to get right. I mean, if you can get how a person talks, you're really more than halfway there, I think. If you look at Dickens and Joyce and Orwell and Kingsley Amis, the writer who I love, and Martin Amis and Raymond Carver and Richard Ford, all of those writers, what they give you when somebody is talking is their DNA. I mean, dialogue is so wonderful in that way because it can communicate information, it can characterize a person, and it can give you what they're not saying. It can give you their evasions and their silences. It's a wonderful way of connoting on the page how absence becomes a presence. We are all what we choose not to say as much as we are what we choose to say. So I work hard on it, and I'm interested in it, and it's something that I love as a reader myself when a writer gets dialogue correct. I think we believe in them then. If we say as a reader, oh yes, I know somebody who talks like that, we're going to believe in the other things that the writer's trying to do as well. So it's well worth getting it right.
And then in your prose writing, when you're writing short stories, and as Diana said, this is the first collection that you've had out for 20 years, are you aware that in the form of the short story that you've got more control over the language than you have as a prose, you know, writing longer prose in novels?
No, I mean, I love when a sentence has grace and poise and music and beauty, and I try hard for that, you know. I mean, particularly, I suppose, over my last 4 or 5 books, really since my novel Star of the Sea, I've tried to sort of supercharge the prose with the sort of grace that I like in the works of the great writers. I think what the short story can do very powerfully, that the novel is probably not for, is the thing that is kind of glimpsed in a corner. You know, a novel is a very intensive examination of the people over 200 or 300 pages. And I suppose we sort of feel, having read a novel, that we should know almost everything about the people. But the great American short story writer Flannery O'Connor said, you know, the short story is really about the thing glimpsed. You know, there might be something in the description of the objects in that woman's hotel room that might reveal more about her than 50 pages of prose would. And that actually, if you don't tell the reader exactly why this poor man has been in hospital, that it provides something for the reader to walk into. The short story, you often feel that you walk into it and touch the walls and you become absolutely a part of the story. You're not sitting, you know, in the auditorium of the theatre or the church waiting for the great priest-like novelist to give you his sermon. You know, I find the short story a very inviting form to write. And, you know, the more you cut them, the more you leave out of them, the more the reader walks into them and creates them and sings the tune of them. You know, I was attracted to that, I suppose. And then, you know, a collection of short stories is like an album, really. You know, you can have some sad ones and some funny ones, and, you know, I have favourite short stories that I might read again in a collection, and ones that I mightn't read at all. So it provides you with a sort of ability to have a range in the storytelling and have different places and different time zones and all of that. And then just the challenge of economy, I suppose, trying to